everyone, thank you for checking out episode number 6. Today we have a change of scenery over at the Bellagio. Now that I have vlogging approval for MGM properties, I'll be able to show you around some more places on the strip. I grab 1,000 in chips and sit down with 500. The 2-5 cap at Bellagio is 500 versus 1,500 at the Wynn, so the games here tend to have a few less pressures to battle with. We pick up A6 of diamonds in early position and open to 15. Only the small blind calls. I just got here, so I don't have any strong reads, but he looks like a recreational player. The flop is great. Ace of clubs, jack of diamonds, 2 of diamonds, giving us top pair and the nut flush draw. He checks, I bet 15, and he calls. The turn is even better, the 8 of diamonds. He checks again, and now I'm wondering how much an ace will call. I put out 75 for a little over pot, and he calls. The river is a blank 6, and he checks it over to me. When he calls a pot bet on the turn, he usually has a strong hand like an ace or better. Sometimes he'll have a middling hand like king jack with the king of diamonds, but I think this is a good spot for one of my favorite things, an overbet. I put out 250. He goes into the tank before folding. He told me later that he folded 2 pair, which had me wondering if I got too greedy. Let's take a look in GTOWizard to find out. Ace-6 suited is a standard open from early position. The small blind will be mixing between calling and raising with most of his range, except for the top part. On the Ace-Jack 2 diamond flop, the small blind is never leading. We actually do a good amount of checking on this flop, and this is another spot where I think people are c-betting more often than 50% of the time. GTO prefers to use a small bet. With the larger bet size, it's still using the same range. It looks like GTO is checking back these top pair plus flush draw hands around 30 to 40% of the time. Facing a small bet, the small blind is still supposed to fold 40% of the time. If you are playing with any crushers who are turning 5s, 4s, or 3s into a bluff here, I'd say to find a new game. On the 8 of diamonds turn, the small blind almost never leads. We bet with a little under half of our range, favoring a half pot size. It looks like I went a little larger than GTO prefers here, and I was surprised to see it checks back with a good amount of nut flushes. The small blind should be folding some top pairs, but I think people tend to be a bit stickier with their aces. The river 6 of spades is a pure check for the small blind. GTO uses a variety of bet sizes here, but it's great to see that it mostly bets pot or more, even finding the all-in 3x jam with king or ace high flushes, balanced out with some blocker bluffs. For our exact hand, it tends to bet a bit smaller, but it goes for the overbet with similar hands. The EV is pretty close between betting smaller and larger here, so overall I think it's a fine spot to go for it. The small blind is actually supposed to fold some 2 pairs and even sets to an overbet, so good on my opponent for finding the fold here. We open pocket queens from the cutoff and get called by the button and the big blind. The flop is king of spades, 9 of spades, 2 of hearts. The big blind checks. Multi-way with a middle pair, I check, and the button checks too. The turn is the 6 of hearts and the big blind checks again. With the button checking behind on the flop, and now the big blind checking to me on the turn, I am feeling a little better about my queens. Thinking that strong hands would want to bet with all the draws out there. I bet 25 for a bit of protection. The button folds, and now the big blind check raises me to 75. There are a ton of draws out there, hearts, spades, and 8-7, and I already discounted some of his strong hands with the check, so I call. The river is an offsuit deuce, bricking all of the draws. Now he puts out a strong bet of 150. As I'm tanking, he says, thinking about calling with ace high again? And this is just such a reliable tell. Anytime someone makes a statement to discount the strength of your hand after betting, they always have it. They want you to think they are betting because you are weak. Unless you are dealing with a speech play master, this tell is 100% strength. Having said that, and knowing in the moment exactly what it meant, my dumbass hand started moving on its own and put in the call. He flips over pocket 6s for a set. Without the live tell, would this still be a GTO approved play? Let's check it out. We open queens from the cutoff and the big blind defends a wide range. We're leaving the button out to make it heads up for the solver, but the main thing to consider multi-way is that both ranges should be tighter than a standard heads up spot. On the king 9-2 two-spade flop, the big blind is never leading. We check back about half the time, and multi-way I'm checking back even more often than that, only betting a very polarized range like ace-king plus and some draws. On the turn 6 of hearts, the big blind leads about 20% of the time, with hands like top pair, 2-pair, sets, and draws, but balances everything with their checking range. After the big blind checks, we're checking about half of the time. Queens should be checked back, but it's not a huge EV difference between betting and checking. Facing a half pot bet, the big blind is mainly calling, but also raises sometimes with top pair and better for value, balanced with a bunch of draws. If we bet the queens, we have to stick around facing the raise. On the river deuce, the big blind keeps betting 60% of the time, even overbetting with some 2 pairs and sets with missed combo draws to balance. Against a pot-sized bet, queens are supposed to fold most of the time. The EV is pretty close between calling and folding, so GTO-wise I wouldn't call this a massive punt. Betting the turn is what got us into trouble, but what really tilted me about this hand was ignoring the live read. We add on for a bit more and open king 8 of clubs in the low jack. The small blind and big blind call. The flop comes down pretty good. King, 10, 8 with 2 spades. They both check to me and I continue for 25. The small blind calls and the big blind folds. The turn is a jack. Not great, but I think there are still lots of pair plus draw hands that we're ahead of. The small blind checks and I bet 55. He calls. The river is an offsuit ace, and now the small blind leads for 140. I think this card is even worse than a spade since I was targeting hands exactly like king queen, queen jack, and queen 10. Leading for this size is pretty polarizing, so it's either a missed flush draw or the straight. He has a lot more random straights than missed flushes, so I found the fold. The button opens to 15, and we're in the small blind with jack 9 of spades. The player on our left is a fun one, so I'm trying to keep him in and just call. The big blind calls behind. The flop is king of diamonds, 4 of diamonds, 3 of spades. We check it over to the button and he checks too. The turn is the 5 of spades. I don't get the sense that anyone is too strong, so I bet 25. The big blind folds and the button calls. The river is the 4 of clubs, leaving us with just jack high. This hand doesn't have great removal to bluff with, but I just don't think the button is checking behind on a wet flop with a king. This is probably one of the worst hands we'll get there with, so I keep firing for 65, and he folds. We go card dead and lose every small pot for a few hours when early position opens to 15 and it folds to us on the button. We look down at queen jack offsuit and make a slightly loose call. The blinds both fold. The flop is a beautiful king 10 9 rainbow. That's what they call the nuts, baby. He checks, we bet 25, and he calls. Would love to see a clean turn. Instead, we get another 9. He checks again, and I'm not too worried about full houses. I don't see him check calling 2 pair or a set on the flop, so we have the effective nuts. The only problem is it might make it harder for us to get paid. I bet a little less than pot, 60, and he calls. The river is a blank 5, and he checks. The pot is about 200, and I only have 300 behind. I should have sized up more on the turn to set up a better stack to pot ratio for the river, but I think the overbet is still reasonable here, so I said, all in. Always nice to fade the snap call when you don't have the nuts, so as he was tanking I tried my best to look stiff and nervous. After a minute he finally folded. I guess it was a tough fold because he immediately stormed off to take a break. Did I leave some value on the table? Let's see what the wizard says. So already we have to adjust this a bit since calling with offsuit garbage like queen jack is not GTO approved. We're going to tweak our hand from queen jack to king jack and the opener's position to cutoff. The action will be the same, flopping a straight, turn pairs bottom card, and blank river. We have the cutoff open and call on the button. And on the ace, queen, 10 rainbow flop, the pre-flop raiser is actually checking 85% of the time. In practice, I don't think people are checking their 2 pairs and sets unless it's a super wet board, but interesting that GTO is basically range checking here. We check back most of the time, but also start building the pot with some top pairs and better. We have to search for our bluffs a little outside of the obvious draws, so we also bet some stuff like gut shots, backdoor flush draws, and tiny pairs. With the straight, GTO prefers to bet 2/3 pot. The out of position player is never check raising. On the bottom card pairing turn, out of position is supposed to lead 75% of the time. This is because when it checks flop, it still has all those sets and 2 pairs in range. After he checks, we check back about 65% of the time. When we do bet, GTO goes small, 1/3 to 1/2 pot. Once again, it's not much of an EV difference to use a larger bet size here, but we can find ourselves in trouble if the opponent has kept their range balanced. Out of position starts folding some weak top and middle pairs, calling with most of the range. It does some check raising with what looks like trips and full houses and not many bluffs to balance it out, just a few top and middle pairs. If GTO is struggling to find bluffs, then I definitely bet this is an underbluff spot in live poker. On the blank river, out of position is almost never leading. For us, GTO only has 2 bet sizes, big and bigger. GTO checks back some straights, but blasting off with king jack off is its preferred move. Awesome to see that this was another spot where the overbet was GTO approved. Early position limps, next to act limps, the small blind, a pro that I've played with at the Wynn before, calls, and we check 7-5 of clubs in the big blind. The flop is queen, 9, 4 with 2 clubs. The small blind checks and we take a stab for 10. Early position calls, +1 folds, and the small blind calls. The turn is the 8 of spades, giving us a gutter to go along with our flush draw. The small blind checks. We can have so many strong hands here, all of the 2 pairs and straights, so throwing in some combo draw bluff sounds good to me. I bet 25. This probably should have been a larger bet, and I know that turn bet sizing is something I need to work on. Early position folds, and the small blind calls. The river is another queen, and he checks. With just 7 high, I didn't really consider checking back as an option. I put out 65, looking to fold out higher cards or weak pairs. Now the small blind raises to 200. This really didn't make any sense to me, but there was nothing I could do but fold. As I muck, he says, "I think we have the same hand." I reply, "No way," and he flips over ace deuce of clubs. This is a wild play, and I'm not sure what better hands he thought he was bluffing, since I'm betting so polarized on the river. Definitely an interesting one, and something to keep in mind next time I see him. After playing for about 8 hours, I decided to call it a day, booking a loss of around 450. Detaching yourself from short-term results is one of the hardest things to do in poker, and is something you can only learn from experience. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you on the next one.